When you press the power button on a Linux system, what happens next feels almost magical. Within seconds, a completely usable operating system appears, ready to accept commands, launch applications, connect to networks, and manage hardware with precision. But behind that smooth startup lies one of the most carefully designed and layered processes in modern computing. The Linux boot process is not a single action. It is a chain of events, each step handing control to the next, each component doing one specific job and then stepping aside. Understanding this process gives you deep insight into how Linux works, why it is so reliable, and how administrators can customize, debug, and optimize systems at a very low level. The story begins even before Linux itself exists in memory. When a computer is powered on, the CPU has no idea what an operating system is. All it knows is that it must start executing instructions from a predefined location. This is where the firmware comes in. On older systems, this firmware is the BIOS, while on modern systems, it is UEFI, regardless of which one is used. Their responsibility is similar: initialize the most basic hardware components and find something bootable. At power on, the CPU jumps to a fixed memory address where the firmware code resides. The firmware performs a power on self-test, commonly called POST. During POST, the system checks that essential hardware components like RAM, CPU, keyboard, and basic storage interfaces are working correctly. If something critical fails here, the system may beep, display an error code, or refuse to continue. Linux is not involved at all at this stage. This is purely firmware level work. Once POST completes, the firmware moves to the next responsibility, selecting a boot device. The firmware maintains a list of bootable devices, such as hard drives, SSDs, USB drives, or network interfaces. The order of this list is configurable by the user. The firmware scans these devices one by one, looking for a valid boot. On BIOS-based systems, the firmware looks at the very first sector of the disk, known as the master boot record. This sector is only 512 bytes in size, which is extremely small. It contains two important things: a small piece of executable code and a partition table. That executable code is the first stage of the boot. Because of the size limitation, it cannot do much on its own. Its main purpose is to locate and load a more capable second stage bootloader from somewhere else on the disk. On UEFI systems, the process is more flexible and modern. Instead of relying on the master boot record, UEFI firmware understands file system, usually FAT32. It looks for executable files in a special partition called the EFI system partition. These executable files are bootloaders, and UEFI can directly load and run them. This removes many of the limitations of the old BIOS method and allows for more advanced features like secure boot and graphical boot menus. Once the firmware has found and executed a bootloader, control passes from firmware to software. This is the moment where the Linux boot process truly begins to take shape. The most common Linux bootloader today is GRUB, the Grand Unified Bootloader, although others like Lilo in older systems or even custom bootloaders can be used. GRUB is responsible for presenting the user with a choice of operating systems or kernel versions and then loading the selected Linux kernel into memory. When GRUB starts, it already knows how to read file systems, which allows it to load configuration files, display menus, and access kernel images stored on disk. This is a major leap in complexity compared to the tiny first stage code that started the process. GRUB reads its configuration, which defines available boot entries. Each entry typically points to a Linux kernel image and an optional initial RAM file system. The configuration may also include kernel parameters, timeout values, default selections, and graphical settings. If the user does nothing, GRUB automatically selects the default entry after a short delay. When an entry is selected, GRUB loads the Linux kernel image into memory. The kernel image is usually a compressed file. GRUB places it at a specific memory location and prepares the system to transfer control to it. Along with the kernel, GRUB often loads an initial RAM disk, commonly known as init. This is a temporary root file system that exists entirely in memory. Before transferring control, GRUB passes parameters to the kernel. These parameters can define hardware options, specify the root file system location, enable or disable debugging features, or modify kernel behavior in many other ways. This ability to pass arguments is one reason Linux is so flexible and configurable. Once everything is loaded, GRUB hands control to the Linux kernel. After this point, the bootloader's job is complete. The kernel takes over, and the system transitions from the bootloader stage into the core operating system startup. The Linux kernel is the heart of the system. When it begins executing, it first decompresses itself in memory. The kernel image stored on disk is compressed to save space. So the first thing the kernel does is expand itself into its full Junibly form. After decompression, the kernel initializes the CPU and memory management systems. It sets up protected mode, enables paging, and prepares the system for multitasking. This is a critical phase where the kernel establishes control over hardware resources and creates the environment in which processes will later run. Next, the kernel detects and initializes hardware. It probes buses, detects connected devices, and loads drivers for them. Some drivers are built directly into the kernel, while others may be loaded dynamically. This hardware detection process is guided by information provided by the firmware, such as the CPI tables, which describe system hardware and power management features. During this phase, the kernel also mounts the initial RAM file system into memory. This temporary file system contains essential tools and drivers needed to continue the boot process. The reason this is necessary is that the real root where the operating system is installed may reside on a device that requires special drivers or setup steps, such as encrypted disks, RAID arrays, or network storage. The kernel then executes the first user space program, traditionally called init. In modern Linux systems, this role is usually performed by systemd, although older systems may use sysv, init, upstart, or other init systems. This moment is extremely important because it marks the transition from kernel space to user space. From here on, most of the boot process is controlled by user space programs rather than the kernel itself. Before init can take full control, the kernel must locate and mount the real route file. This is often handled with the help of the init. The initramfs contain scripts and tools that identify the root file system, unlock encrypted volumes if necessary, assemble logical volumes, and mount the final route directory. Once the real root file system is mounted, the system switches from the temporary initramfs environment to the actual root file system on disk. The temporary environment is discarded, freeing up memory. Actually, at this point, the kernel executes the init process from the real root file system, and the main system startup begins. The init system is responsible for starting all other system services. In systems using systemd, init is actually systemd itself. Systemd is designed to start services in parallel, manage dependencies, and provide fast and reliable boot times. It reads unit files, which describe services, sockets, devices, mount points, and targets. Systemd begins by initializing its own internal state and setting up logging. It then determines the default target, which is similar to a run level in older systems. A target represents a desired system state, such as a multi-user text mode or a graphical desktop environment. Based on the selected target, systemd starts the required services. These services include essential components like the system logger, networking services, device managers, and login managers. Each service is started only after its dependencies are satisfied, ensuring that everything comes up in the correct order. While systemd is starting services, the kernel continues to manage hardware events. Device nodes are created dynamically, file systems are mounted, and background processes begin running. For systems with a graphical interface, the display manager is started, which eventually presents the user with a login screen. On servers or systems without a graphical interface, the boot process may end with a login prompt on the console. At this point, the system is fully booted and ready for use. The Linux boot process, which began with a simple press of the power button, has completed its journey. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Linux boot process is how customizable it is. Administrators can modify bootloader configurations, kernel parameters, initramfs contents, and init system settings to tailor the boot process to their needs. This flexibility allows Linux to run on everything from tiny embedded devices to massive servers and supercomputers. For example, kernel parameters can be used to enable verbose logging during boot, which is invaluable for If a system fails to boot correctly, administrators can inspect boot messages to identify where things went wrong. The ability to drop into an emergency shell during early boot is another powerful feature that helps recover from mistakes. The initramfs itself can be customized to include additional drivers or tools. This is particularly useful for systems with unusual storage setups or custom hardware. By including the necessary components in the initramfs, the kernel can access the root file system even in complex environments. The choice of init system also affects how the boot process behaves. Systemd is optimized for speed and reliability, but other init systems may prioritize simplicity or traditional Unix design. Regardless of the NIT system used, the fundamental structure of the boot process remains the same. Firmware initializes hardware, a bootloader loads the kernel initializes the system, and init starts user space services. Security is another important aspect of the Linux boot process. Features like secure boot ensure that only trusted bootloaders and kernels are executed. This helps prevent malicious code from taking control of the system during startup. Disk encryption adds another layer of security, protecting data even if the physical device is stolen. In modern Linux distributions, much of this complexity is hidden from the user. The system boots quickly and quietly, often displaying only a logo or progress bar. But beneath that polished surface, the same fundamental steps are taking place, just as they have for decades, refined and optimized over time. Understanding how the Linux boot process works gives you a deeper appreciation for the operating system. It reveals why Linux is so adaptable, why it can recover from failures that would cripple other systems, and why it remains a favorite among developers, administrators, and enthusiasts. From the first instruction executed by the CPU to the final login prompt. Every stage of the Linux boot process has a clear purpose. Each component does one job and passes control along, creating a chain of trust and functionality that transforms inert hardware into a living, breathing system. Once you see this process as a story rather than a mystery, Linux becomes less intimidating and far more fascinating. The next time your Linux system boots, remember that you are watching a carefully choreographed sequence of events. Firmware hands off to a bootloader, the bootloader hands off to the kernel hands off to init, and init brings the system to life. It is one of the most elegant examples of layered system design and computing, and it is happening right in front of you every time you press the power button.